Guys, we're currently in Tamworth at Tamworth Castle. Can I just say as well, the people that work inside Tamworth Castle are some of the nicest people I've ever met while doing these videos. So big yourself up. Also, the video that I'm going to put together, it's not going to have loads of the inside shots. I like to leave a little bit to the imagination. So that means that you can come down and check it out for yourself. Anyway, Tamworth Castle, let's get into it, guys.
If you stand in Tamworth and look up at the castle properly, not just as a familiar landmark in the middle of town, but as a place that has watched centuries come and go from the same patch of high ground, you start to realise that this is not simply the story of one medieval building, because what survives here now belongs to several different periods at once. And the reason it still matters is that every age that inherited it found some new reason to keep it standing. That's what makes Tamworth Castle so much more interesting than just another old stronghold with a long timeline behind it. Because if you only begin with the Norman stonework, you miss the fact that this site has already been important long before the castle most people recognise today was ever built. Tamworth was one of the great centres of Anglo-Saxon Mercia, a place associated with kings, authority and administration. And that early importance is really the key to understand everything that came later. Because the Normans didn't create significance here out of nothing. They took over a place that already carried weight. In the Saxon period, Tamworth was one of the main royal centres of Mercia, which immediately lifts this out of the category of purely local building story. Mercia itself was one of the most important kingdoms in early medieval England, and places like this sat right at the heart of how power was expressed, organised and defended. So before there was ever a Norman castle on this mound, there was already a place here where important people gathered, decisions were made and status was visible in a very real and practical sense. Then the world around Tamworth began to change, and not in some slow, gentle way, because Viking pressure reshaped huge parts of England and Tamworth itself was attacked and destroyed in the 9th century. After that it became much more than a royal centre, because it was now sitting close to the frontier of the Danelaw, which meant this was not only a place worth ruling from, but a place that had to be protected properly if control of the area was going to be held. That's why Athelad matters so much in the story of Tamworth, because when she refortified the town in 913, she was reinforcing a place that had already mattered politically, while also tying it directly into the wider struggle to defend and recover territory in the face of Viking power. She was one of the most remarkable figures of the age. And a connection to Tamworth gives this place an importance that goes far beyond the town itself, because it places it directly inside the story of how England was being reshaped in the early medieval period. And there's another side to that early history that's worth holding on to, because it's easy to talk about rulers, conflict and power while forgetting that places like this ever had to function day to day. Tamworth was a working settlement where people lived, moved, traded and produced food. And archaeology has even revealed very early watermills here, which is a reminder that this was not only a ceremonial or defensive centre, but a practical one as well, tied to daily life in ways that often get lost when we look back at places like this purely through the lenses of kings and warfare. When the Normans arrived after 1066, they were not choosing this site by chance, because they were doing what they did all over England, which was to physically stamp their authority onto places that had already mattered. The first castle here was the late 11th century Motte Bailey, so the earliest Norman phase would have looked very different from what people see today. It would have been a more immediate and functional form of domination, built quickly, probably with timber structures, and designed to control the surrounding ground while making Norman power impossible to ignore. That part of the story matters because Tamworth Castle did not appear fully formed in stone, and that's one of the reasons it can be slightly hard to read if you treat it as though it all belongs to one date. What began as a late 11th century earthwork stronghold was later developed into a shell keep in stone. And that shift tells you that this site was no longer simply a temporary show of force by conquerors who needed to secure a region quickly, but a place that was becoming more permanent, more established and more architecturally ambitious. And Tamworth's not just important because it's old, because obviously England has no shortage of old places. What makes this site stand out is that what survives here is unusual, and in heritage terms genuinely significant, because shell keeps are not especially common, and Tamworth preserves that development in a way that makes it nationally important. So when people say the castle's impressive, that's not just local loyalty talking, because the building really does have architectural and archaeological value that reaches well beyond the town. Once the Norman castle was established, the story begins to turn more clearly toward the families who held it. And in the high medieval period, none are more important than the Marmions. England's. They held the castle for roughly 2 centuries, and what really makes them stand out is that they held the role of royal champion to the kings of England, which meant Tamworth Castle was never simply the private base of one noble family, because it came with a much stronger connection to royal power than most places of its kind. That changes how you see the castle in this period, because it weren't just a defensible residence sitting in the landscape, but a place tied to ceremony, status and service at a level of the crown. Royal visits were associated with it, the family themselves were people of national importance rather than only local influence. And the castle would have carried an importance that went beyond its walls simply because who lived there and the role they held. One figure who stands out particularly is a guy called Philip Marmion, because by the time of his death the castle was already part of a long-established noble world, and when he died without a legitimate male heir, it marked the end of one of the site's defining dynasties. That matters because the story of Tamworth Castle is shaped again and again by inheritance, marriage and change in ownership, and this is one of the clear moments where one chapter closes and another begins. From there the castle passed through the Frevilles and later the Ferrers, and under those later families the building began to change in a way that was absolutely central to how it looks and feels today. Because this is where Tamworth Castle starts to move much more clearly from a fortress to residence. It does not stop being a castle, but it does become something broader than one. A place shaped as much by comfort and display as by defence. Under the Ferrers especially, the building was altered in ways that really shift its identity, and one of the clearest examples is the Great Hall built in the 15th century, because a room like this was never simply somewhere to eat. A hall was one of the social centres of the household, a place where hospitality, rank, ceremony and daily life met. And once a castle begins to develop those kinds of spaces more fully, it starts to feel much less like a purely military structure, and much more like the seat of a powerful family living in a way designed to be seen and understood by others. That transformation carried on into the Tudor period, when the castle was altered further with larger windows, new wings, stair turrets, and more comfortable upper rooms. So by that stage, the building was not simply holding on to an older medieval form, but deliberately being reshaped to reflect changing ideas about status. In other words, Tamworth Castle was no longer just somewhere to defend from attack, but somewhere to live in well, and somewhere that projected wealth and position to anyone who saw it. And that's why the building can feel so visually mixed now, because it's not a pure Norman fortress and it's not a pure Tudor house either. It carries both of those identities at once, along with later additions besides, and different parts of it speak in different architectural languages depending on when they were built and what people wanted the place to do for them at the time. Some parts still feel defensive and severe, while others feel domestic, formal and almost surprisingly refined for a place that people still instinctively call a castle. And even so, history has a habit of dragging buildings back into older roles when the world around them turns unstable. And that's exactly what happened in the 17th century during the Civil War, because by then Tamworth had long since developed beyond its earliest military form, yet it suddenly found itself useful as a place of conflict once again. And that's one of the most striking things about the castle's long life, because it reminds you that old walls can take on new urgency very quickly when the political world starts to fracture. A royalist garrison occupied the castle for Charles I, and because Tamworth sat in a strategically useful position, it became involved in the wider struggle between Crown and Parliament. At that point, the castle was no longer simply an inherited noble residence, because the old walls were being drawn back into active military use, and the site was once again part of a dangerous and shifting landscape. In 1643, Parliamentarian forces besieged and captured the castle after a short attack, and that shows that Tamworth was still considered worth taking. This was not some decorative survival being ignored while the war moved elsewhere, because the site still had enough practical value to be fought over, which says a great deal about how old fortifications could remain relevant long after their original builders were gone. And even after that capture, the pressure on the place didn't simply vanish, because a later attempt to retake it failed, which means Tamworth Castle once again found itself right in the middle of a national crisis. But as always, the good people of Tamworth come through, although that survival shouldn't be taken for granted, because many castles in England did not pass through the 17th century intact, whether through deliberate damage, neglect or slow loss of purpose, whereas Tamworth managed to continue into yet another phase of its life, After the Civil War, the castle entered a quieter but still important period, passing through later families and gradually becoming less a seat of direct national significance, and more of a property with a complicated afterlife. It was still occupied, still used, and still visible, but the sort of power it represented had changed, and that shift becomes especially clear by the time you reach the 18th and 19th centuries, when the building begins to belong much more to the world of tenancy, domestic life, and local standing than to that of the medieval aristocratic command. When the building begins to belong much more to the world of tenancy, domestic life, and local standing than to that of medieval aristocratic command. By the Victorian period, that change becomes one of the more interesting parts of the whole story, because the castle was still inhabited, yet the people living there now belonged to a very different England from the one that had produced its earliest owners. A place that had once housed noble families tied to the crown was now part of a town shaped by domestic service, trade, business, and industry. And that contrast is one of the clearest examples of how the building kept adapting to the needs of the age, without losing its older identity entirely. Thomas Cook is a particularly good example of that later shift, because as a wealthy textile manufacturer, his place in the castle says a lot about how power and status had changed in England by the 19th century. The building was no longer tied only to inherited aristocratic importance, because it had also become part of a world shaped by industrial wealth, local enterprise, and the social ambitions of a very different class of owner or tenant. Once again, the castle did not stop being useful, it simply became useful in a different way. Then came one of the most important moments in the castle's modern survival, because when it was brought for the people of Tamworth in 1897, and later opened as a museum, the whole future of the building changed. Without that decision, it's very easy to imagine a different outcome, where the place drifts into private obscurity, awkward redevelopment, or a long decline, but instead it became part of the town's public life. And that's now been the case for well over a century. What I like about Tamworth Castle in today's world is that it's not just a survivor sitting above the town looking impressive from the outside, because it's still somewhere people can actually go in. We can walk around and connect with it properly. Inside, you can even see pieces of the Staffordshire Hoard, along with displays that tie the castle back into a much older story of Anglo-Saxon Tamworth. And that gives the place a much stronger sense of continuity, because the present-day experience of visiting does not just stop at medieval walls. It reaches back into the earlier world that made this site important in the first place. And it's not a place that feels dead either, because there's exhibitions, events, and activities through the year. Activities and events that keep drawing people back in and stop it becoming the kind of museum people only visit once on a school trip and never think about again. That matters more than it might sound, because a place like this survives best when it feels still woven into the life of the town, rather than simply admired from a distance as something old or untouchable. Even the restoration work can still be seen in the same positive light, because although old buildings always need care, the fact that money and effort is still being invested into Tamworth Castle says a lot about how much it still means to the place around it. It's being looked after not out of habit, but because people still believe it deserves a future. And that's probably one of the strongest signs possible that it's never really slipped into irrelevance. It's probably the best way to understand Tamworth Castle as a whole. It's not just the story of a Norman fortress, or a merchant centre, or a Tudor residence, or even a Civil War stronghold. It's the story of a site that never quite stopped mattering, even as the reasons for its importance kept changing. It mattered to the Mercian rulers because Tamworth was one of the centres of their kingdom. It mattered to Athelad because this ground was worth defending. To the Normans because it was already a strategic and symbolic site. It even mattered to the Marmions because it expressed status and royal connection. And it mattered to later owners because it could be reshaped into a residence that reflected wealth, ambition, and changing ideas of power. Then it mattered in wartime because it still had military value. And in the Victorian period because it remained useful and prestigious. And it mattered enough to the people of Tamworth for them to take it into public ownership and make it part of the town's future. So if someone asks what Tamworth Castle really is, the simplest answer is probably the strongest one. It's a survivor, not just in the sense that it somehow escaped change, but because one generation after another kept finding reasons to hold on to it. And that's why it still stands above the town now, with so many different layers of history still clinging to it. That hill mattered before the castle was ever built, and the castle still mattered long after its original military purpose had faded. And even now, after centuries of conflict, family ownership, rebuilding, adaptation and care, it still holds its place in the town as something people feel is worth preserving. And that's probably the clearest sign of all that Tamworth Castle was never just a relic, because it's still a living part of the town's identity. And the reason it continues to hold people's attention now is that so much of England's history, from Mercia to the present day, has left its mark here without ever quite managing to erase what came before.